Welcome to this episode of The World According to Irina Tsukerman, our very special series on global politics on the KJ Masterclass Live. Irina Tsukerman is a US based national security and human rights lawyer as well as a renowned geopolitical analyst. Her writings and commentary have appeared in diverse US and international media and have been translated to over a dozen languages. Every fortnight in The World According to Irina Tsukerman, we traverse the geopolitical landscape and delve into pressing international issues and gain insights from Irina's expert perspective. Welcome to the show once again, Irina.
Thank you so much. So happy to be here.
You're welcome. You are welcome. So, Irina, lots of big topics again today. Alexei Navalny's death and so many is making a lot of news. So, let's start with that. The funeral, if I understand, is tomorrow. So, help us understand who was Alexei Navalny. A lot of people have suddenly woken up to his name. What does he mean? What does his death mean? And what does it mean for Russia? What does it mean for Putin's future?
Now, Navalny was an opposition member. He, at one point, actually tried to challenge Putin for presidency. That did not work out so well. He was accused of various crimes. He was, at one point, poisoned. He survived the poisoning, ended up receiving treatment in Germany, but eventually, and against all warnings, returned to Russia, where he was immediately arrested, sentenced to a lengthy prison term, which was eventually compounded by other accusations, was relocated a couple of times in prisons to further and further prisons in very far areas of Russia. And he was found dead over a very common ailment that happens to prisoners, particularly suffering poor conditions of maltreatment. He had essentially something like a blood clot. The full extent of his health issues has not yet been released, but it was confirmed that that was the cause of death. And he was a subject of a documentary by his supporters. He ran an organization that touted itself as being anti-corruption. Ironically, a lot of the people who were working and who were close to Navalny had close ties with Putin's allies. Bank financiers like the Alpha Bank and the famous oligarch Mikhail Friedman, who was eventually sanctioned in the US and Europe. There were other characters around him, like one of his staffers, leaders of his anti-corruption initiative, Maria Pevchik, who did her PhD in London, and she wrote it on the British ethnic sociology of different ethnicities under Alexander Dugin, who is an ideologue who is close to Putin as well, and reflects a lot of ideology and philosophy that's shared by the Kremlin and has become a sort of a marking of Russia under Putin. So there's a lot of questions about who Navalny really was and what was his values. But the one thing we do know is that he did not appear in any way to be disloyal to Russia's national vision. In many respects, he actually agreed and supported some of Putin's actions until recently. He supported the war in Ukraine until fairly late in the game, so to speak. And he did a lot legitimately to expose the corruption of the Kremlin and the vast wealth accumulated by Putin and his close circle of supporters and the oligarchs, and essentially a lot of it came from the national treasury, from the coffers. It was ill-begotten and caused a lot of scandal. So that was Navalny's claim to fame. The documentaries exposing Putin's huge palaces and assorted other lifestyle choices that challenged the vision of Russia as a modernized egalitarian state in light of a lot of poverty and infrastructural underdevelopment in various parts of the country. And the fact that he died after many trials and tribulations and trumped up charges and likely torture and starvation, raised a chorus of indignation around the Western world. In particular, the U.S. imposed approximately 500 additional sanctions on various Russian entities as a result. But the question is, why did they wait until Navalny died in prison for that to happen, when he was in prison for a number of years, and none of that took place when he was first, taken into custody, or when he was poisoned, as so many others who criticized Putin happened. And what's the most interesting part is what happened after Navalny's death. And I'm leaving aside the completely disgraceful episode where the regime did not want to release his body to his mother, or blackmailed his mother over the circumstances of the burial. I'm not even talking about that. I'm talking about the new law that Putin signed almost immediately afterwards, which banned anyone from criticizing Russian policies or him personally, which I think is the apotheosis of of the very corruption and authoritarianism that the remnants of Russian opposition have been exposing. And you can criticize these oppositioners for simply being power hungry and looking forward to get into power themselves, of not having clean hands, of being very much part of the same milieu, and all of these could be very fair criticisms, but it doesn't take away from what they're exposing, which is the fact that the Russia has become increasingly closed society, and its laws mirror those of the most authoritarian regimes in the world at this point.
Right, right. So, what does it mean going forward? With all these things happening, the world leaders criticizing, and his wife, Navalny's wife, now is also openly talking about uh, that justice will prevail. And his mother also, when she was there was this media reports that she was apparently given 3 hours for from the authorities to decide what she wants to do, and finally they seem to have relented. Now the funeral is happening in Moscow tomorrow. What is happening in that part of the world? What is Putin trying to achieve here through whatever? There are a lot of questions suddenly coming up. Why couldn't have this been more transparent, especially for him? When elections are there, if there is no wrongdoing, why not show to the world much more transparently? Especially, with the attempt to reach out to the world media, the world intelligentsia through that interview just a few days back. So I want to understand the messaging that one gets through these happenings. We don't know the truth, as we keep on getting different reports and people form their own opinion. Help us understand these part of these developments in that part of the world.
So getting an accurate story out of Russia nowadays is not easy, precisely because the media has been so restricted. In fact, one of the co-founders of a major independent initiative called Memorial, a human rights organization, a Russian one, not a foreign organization, was just thrown in prison after basically calling attention to all these recent circumstances. And these events happen amidst a slew of other attacks by Putin against his critics abroad. He put he issued an arrest warrant against the head of state of Estonia for taking down old Soviet monuments inside Estonia, and essentially treating Estonia not as an independent country but as a potential target for future annexation efforts. He's attacked a number of Western critics, including a relatively minor figure from the Facebook Meta company, a spokesperson, for simply going along with the official company policy, which, by the way, are negotiated along with the U.S. government and its policy. So In that respect, U.S. policies, U.S. companies have to follow official U.S. law. So essentially, for not violating American law, this guy is put on a wanted list and is charged with the terrorism-related charges, and is basically banned from Russia or any country that that is close to Russia. So this is all has been happening around Navalny, and I think Putin has been trying to balance this tough guy, strongman image who doesn't an image of someone who doesn't care about Western opinion and publicity and human rights related criticism and pressure, and appear especially to his supporters and his growing base around the world as someone who just doesn't put up with the Western bullying. But on the other hand, he also realized that he may have overstepped the extent. Like he had to basically walk back the funeral related arrangements after it turned into a complete scandal, because it's just unnecessary, petty and cruel. It doesn't this is we are talking about a dead body and a burial arrangements. This is not an issue of political will or legal concerns. This is a humanitarian gesture that he was denying to somebody's mother, and she was not particularly politically involved. She so I think the further a leader or a state becomes authoritarianism, the more they lose grasp with the reality and with the outside perceptions, and the more they struggle with balancing these internal expectations and this projection of power with the realization that they're self-isolating essentially, and that they're forgetting about basic norms that are accepted by most societies as part of a social construct and sort of a contractual obligations of being involved in with other countries in managing their affairs. So this is where Putin is increasingly losing his grasp. This is something in his early years he managed very carefully, very very cunningly. I'm not necessarily agreeing with what he was doing, but it's hard to deny that he was successful at what he was doing. But the more he self-isolated, the more his decisions are informed only by people who approve of everything that he does, and the more he essentially buys into his own vision of the world without having a check on what actually works and what doesn't. And this is what we're seeing today.
Right, right. If you see from my individual perspective, those images of a mother walking in the snow in the wilderness, along with her advisor for her son's body, those images are much more. And a lot of the world looks at these images, thinks in images rather than what actually the fact will be or one would like to. But I want to understand, Irina, is that most of the world leaders, they were aware of Navalny being there, but suddenly they have woken up. Is it because of the election year and it sounds very good for them to speak in this voice and not the real voice of democracy or independence or a lot of other things that they claim that they stand for? Why now? Is it because of suitability or is it because they have a larger aim in mind?
Well, it's actually because of Russia's upcoming elections. And so the timing between these things, Navalny dying literally days after Tucker Carlson's interview, where Tucker Carlson, if you recall, actually called for leaders to, that said that leaders, real leaders, have to do a certain amount of killing. And by the way, he did not specify that he was referring to necessity of sending troops into war or some military operations. No, he actually indicated that he was talking about taking out internal enemies, assassinations, political killings, that sort of thing. He basically justified it. A few days later, Navalny is dead, and next month we're seeing Russia's elections, and all the opposition has been banned from running, and the messaging from the state media in Russia is that the country is so unified behind Putin that there's no longer a need for elections at all. So this might be the last election in Russia. So I think this is the timing of all these things on the one hand from Russia is sending a strong message to the West that Russia is pursuing this course, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. But on the other hand, the West is sending the message and saying, you know what, you know, it's bad enough that you've been imprisoning all these people. You've had all these people, who died under highly suspicious circumstances. But this guy died in your prison, and he died at a relatively young age after being treated horribly. So, whether or not it was an ordered hit or just a death arising from these circumstances, the blame lies on you, and you're running this death right before your own election. So, this is nothing but state terror in action. That's what they're calling out. Yes, absolutely, you're correct that it's hypocritical to rely on just this one incident when there's been a string of political assassinations, disappearances, violence, arrests, and so forth. And most of them, were received relatively muted reaction, except for the incidents that occurred on Western soil. But basically, the Navalny death is being treated as a culmination, the last straw that broke the patience of the Western world, with making excuses, justifications, or attempting to sort of, stay silent and, look the other way on other issues. So it's not that Navalny is being treated as some sort of an exceptional figure. Is that his death is basically has been treated by the regime, by the Kremlin, in such a blatantly brazen way, in such a brazen challenge to the West, that there is no choice but to react, especially since this is right before the elections, and this is like essentially undermines any credibility in Russia's election coming up, and the legitimacy of the leadership, therefore.
Right. And forgetting the controversy around his death for a bit, in terms of Navalny himself, how will he be remembered as someone fighting for a cause? He could have easily stayed back in Germany, gone back anywhere, but he went back to Russia, knowing the difficult times ahead for himself. So, who will he be remembered as? Because in his death, a lot of now talks are happening. Even those people who would not have known him now know him, almost like coming out as some sort of a icon of important voice. And also his wife now is speaking out openly, and it will continue to make news in the days to come.
Well, there's been, a host of articles and hagiographies praising Navalny to no end as an exceptionally courageous figure who dared to challenge the state and didn't break in light of all these mistreatments and poisonings and so forth. Personally, I think the story is more complicated. I believe that Navalny was misled, manipulated into coming back to Russia, maybe with false hopes and promises, maybe by threatening his family in Germany, because Russia recently is thought to be responsible for the death of a defector in Spain. It's in European soil, and it has previously attempted to assassinate various individuals in the UK and the United States and so forth. So it's not part of the course that they may have threatened his wife and his family. They may have promised him some sort of a compromise. Who knows? I don't believe that he thought that he would meet the end that he did when he came. That would have been a very reckless decision, not necessarily courageous, because it would not accomplish anything other than get him killed, and it certainly didn't stop Putin or put an end to what Russia is doing, or turn the Western policies by itself. I think the war in Ukraine did much more than the death of any of the internal dissidents and opposition members. I think those things are never the ultimate deciding factor. It's always foreign policy and security that decides the policies, not individual human rights cases.
Right, Irina. Russia is in a lot of news. Putin is also in a lot of news. As we talked about Navalny, you also mentioned about the assassination of a Russian defector in Spain, and So all these things are happening, and now this whole threat, alleged threat to Moldova about Transnistria. What's happening there? What should the world do? Another front opening up, Ukraine, Israel, and now this one. How does it look like? What is this issue all about?
Now, Moldova, the Transnistria is a region of Moldova that's been occupied by Russia for a very long time, even before this recent Ukraine attack. And there has been an effort to rile up separatism there, just as it happened in Crimea, in the Donbass region, and in other areas, parts of Georgia and so forth. But now what's changed is there's an effort now to induce not only an occupation but a full annexation of that area, and possibly a political coup inside Moldova that was allegedly thwarted after a failed effort. And who knows, there likely are to be repeated efforts. The issue is not fully resolved, despite the fact that the immediate threat has appeared to have subsided for the time being. So this is an ongoing development, but it is to be expected, because if Russia is met with any success anywhere, politically and militarily, it makes sense for it to push further in the pursuit of its geopolitical agenda. Why not? If it already has the forces on the ground, if it does not require significant expenditures and effort, and if there's no serious challenge or pushback from everyone else, why should it not continue to do what it's doing? And that's exactly what we are seeing. We're seeing Russia advancing in Ukraine in light of the political controversy over humanitarian aid in the US, and in light of Europe simply not being able to keep up with the needs. And so now that Russia feels it has a path to, if not a complete victory, then some gains in Ukraine, it feels emboldened to pursue its interests in other areas where it already has some hold.
Right, right. Moldova is borders Ukraine, and Ukraine is now, waiting for a lot of support from the Western world, from the US. And with the change in government, Trump has already made his stance clear. Let's see what happens in that. But Ukraine is facing, how do you say, is it a setback, or because it has abandoned Avdiivka? Sorry if I'm not pronouncing it very correct.
Yes.
Yeah, and then there is this ascension talks, both Moldova and Ukraine. And amidst all these things, in one of the recent speeches, Zelensky talked about 30,000 deaths. I don't know how far that figure is correct and all, but this was the first time, if I understand, they have mentioned about this number of deaths. This is very alarming. We don't know about the Russian figures, but help us understand what is happening on the Ukraine front. How should the world look at it?
Well, Ukraine deaths are probably much higher than 31,000, but the Russian deaths are also quite significant, and the latest estimates from Pentagon put them above 400,000. And it's hard to have an exact count, but it seems reasonable given the waves of mobilization that we have seen. The replacement gives us some ideas about what troops have been lost, even if Russia is not admitting the exact count, and even if there's no possibility of counting all the bodies yet by Ukraine. It will take a long time to get the evidence of the exact losses. We know that Russia, even with Ukraine facing these extreme challenges related to shortage of ammo and other advanced ammunition and advanced weapons, and related to also limitations, lack of rotation of troops, and this simple exhaustion of the troops, Russia has a difficult time ahead. It's despite the fact that Ukraine has been stymied by this shortage of ammo, it has been using other types of weapons efficiently and causing significant financial losses to Russia, and a lot of it's very expensive in equipment and jet planes and other forces that are difficult to replace quickly. Russia is receiving some aid from North Korea, from Iran, but all of these things are, don't make up for the very heavy, for the tanks, for the jets, for the vessels that are being sunk and destroyed. So, uh, I think Russia has a very difficult path to victory. I think Ukraine will try to hold off as long as possible while Europe and other countries figure out how to compensate for the US aid. And US still has options. It has still has some weapons in the pipeline that are set to be delivered. The F-16 training is almost complete. Um, and President Biden may choose to decide, if there is a government shutdown, for instance, to release some of the weapons that he has the legal power to give to Ukraine without congressional authorization, approval. So we'll see what happens. I think he's been avoiding that to avoid controversy in an election year. But if the situation is as dire as it appears to be heading, he may have to do that. So we will see what happens. But so far, Ukraine is warning about a potential Russian offensive around May.
Right, right. And Irina, I mean, all these talks, there was this news suddenly. I was also surprised to read that some Indians were also, these were reports that they were fighting. Actually, the main story came out that actually they were misled by some of the agents, and they landed up, at the battlefront. How do you look at this particular thing? In that now they have been released as part of the latest news that I read. But how do you look at this part? Why is Russia hiring these people, or from? I'm sure there might be more people from other places in the world. What is happening in this regard?
Well, here's the thing. First of all, Russia is suffering very heavy losses, and many of its best fighters have already been killed off. So, yes, it can always replenish its arsenal with an endless stream of random people, but a lot of people are, simply fleeing the country as refugees. They don't want to fight, they don't want to enlist in the army. Uh, Russia's been trying to throw in various ethnic minorities from peripheral areas, but even those people are not enough. It's been using all these fighters as cannon fodder. It's been recruiting mercenaries. It's been doing everything possible, but a lot of these things just don't work out well. Because what happens when you take people from different international militaries who don't speak Russian or Ukrainian or even English necessarily in some cases, who come from a completely different military background, who've never had to train with Russian forces, and it makes for very difficult fighting. It has tried to recruit Syrians. Syrians very quickly found themselves met with exceptional cold temperatures in the middle of last winter and were either heavily wounded or just simply fled. It was not the climate in which they were used to fighting. Not to mention, most of them did not speak a word of Russian and found it very difficult to integrate. This is the problem when you bring in mercenaries from countries that don't share your language and military culture. With India, I think Russia is just desperate to find anyone, and even hires people under false pretenses so they don't have to pay them much. They find poor people, probably promise them money, tells them that they're for some campaign somewhere. They even maybe even tell them that they're going to some other place that's not Ukraine for some other reason, and they end up in situations quite to their surprise. And this is exactly what happened with the Russian soldiers in the very beginning. They didn't even know where they were going, and they thought they were going for training exercises, not for war. So imagine being in the middle of another country that you don't know very well. People there speak a different dialect, and you just find yourself surprising. You're told go kill people when you thought you were just there for training. So this is a shock, and this is not a good way to manage anyone, because if someone is misled into a war effort, they are not going to be prepared, and they're not going to be to have the morale to fight, and they're not going to want to be there. So I think Russia has created its own problems with such efforts. It's just not honest, and it's obviously leading to completely absurd situations.
Right, right. Talking of Indian citizens in Russia, talking, let's move on to farmer protest in India. But it's not about just India. A lot of farmer protests are happening all across the world. Netherlands, Poland, France, all those images are coming out into even to India. And Indian farmers are also, they have their own, at least they have a particular demand. So why is this a lot of farmer protests are happening? Are they linked, or are they all separately happening in their own way? Indian farmers have their own demand about MSP. The government has promised that. Let's see how what happens there. But tell us about the other places. Is it linked? Is India also linked in some manner? Help us understand all this.
So, look, the agricultural sector will always have its own economic interests and goals, and it's always been the case all over the world. In the United States, the farmers have their own issues. The U.S. government has tried to give them subsidies. It's always a sector that's important, central to the economy, but at the same time is seen as less economically stable than, for instance, an industry. And there's always cycles to, and environmental factors and all sorts of other geopolitical factors. So it's always a major sector that's always has a lot of ability to pressure governments, but at the same time it also has its own vulnerabilities. The farmers in all of these places have legitimate grievances, those grievances are not the same in all of the places. For instance, in Netherlands, the farmers were concerned about exceptionally strict ESG requirements by the government and the threats to confiscate lands towards non food producing goals. For instance, in Poland, the farmers were concerned about the import of foreign grain during a time of economic crisis, and essentially being put out of business by neighboring countries. All of this all of these issues and concerns are real. They're not all identical because every country has its own economic situations. Obviously, the farmers in Poland, farmers in Netherlands, and farmers in India or France all have completely different circumstances. What, however, unites them all is the fact that other state actors exploit these very legitimate concerns and the government response or non-response to them to create this optics of unity of purpose, which does not necessarily exist because all of these people, as I said, face completely different specific economic circumstances and turn it into this wave of economic warfare against governments and create this illusion of a mass movement among people who normally would not coordinate because they would have very little in common and would have other than being farmers and belonging to the same sector, they would not have the same economic demands or concerns, and it's very difficult to coordinate these things unless you are politically involved, and not all of these farmers are political activists. Most of them are just farmers. But people who know what they're doing, and usually in many cases it's actually Russia, in some cases China, we're seeing join in some of these campaigns. They exploit these grievances, they create these optics, they create the coordination element that would not normally exist, and they utilize it to advance their own goals that have nothing to do with those farmers, and they exploit the farmers and they cause them problems actually, and they exacerbate tensions between the governments and the farmers instead of helping resolve the issues amicably. And we are seeing with the Polish farmers that started as a very normal concern about managing flows of grain into the country. Now we're seeing farmers actually block borders with Ukraine, violate, engage in acts of civil disobedience, cause problems, in the wartime, cause security issues, and come out with communist flags and all sorts of propaganda that were not initially there. They were not part of the initial wave of concerns. And there's an extremist political party involved in organizing those farmers in Poland. It's a Polish party, but it has links to Russia. It's hard right wing, very extreme fringe right wing, not any of the mainstream political parties. But they've so Russia is kind of behind the scenes operating through these local proxies. So if I had to guess, I would say that there is the same situation in every one of those countries, that there are legitimate concerns. Some political group finds out that, they analyze the situation, they figure out what are these people really concerned about, and then they basically use it to try to create a dispute, and they say, oh well, we're all united around the world. But all these people don't even speak the same language. So what really unites them is like communists, international communists, who were saying all the workers of the world unite. Now they're saying all the farmers of the world unite. I mean, it's a very familiar tactic if you look at it this way. That doesn't mean that those people don't deserve to have their day in if not in court or at the parliament or wherever they have their grievances. They absolutely need to be heard. The problem is when you have foreign entities intervening, it gives governments an excuse not to deal with the real problem. So or else they feel terrorized and they don't want to look like they're submitting to foreign influence or to demands by groups, so they kind of dismiss, and it only polarizes and exacerbates this issue, which is why it's very important to be smart, to have meetings, but to also seek out all these foreign, or the, foreign/domestic political partnerships that are infiltrating these movements, and get them out of the picture, and deal directly with the locals, and show a very kind of forward way of thinking, and listen to the people and listen to their concerns, and try to not let third parties get involved in any way.
Absolutely, absolutely. People have to be very smart, even those who are protesting, because wherever people see numbers, a lot of vested interests try to put in their own points, agenda into the real agenda that is, that people are demanding. There is so much to understand, as I said. And what do we understand of something that's happening in our neighborhood about Pakistan? What is happening about what should we make sense of this? Somebody wins, but the government is being made by someone else. But does this show that military is, lost its grip out of power, and in the coming days it will be they will have to rethink about their own strategy? How does this whole thing in Pakistan look to you, and the future as well?
This is what happens when you put the political process above the actual values. What I mean by that is that, yes, Pakistan has this tradition of elections, but it has never at any point had a strong civil society, independent civil society. It does not have a culture or political culture of law and order, and it certainly doesn't have any liberalism, to speak of. We see that from the fact that every single prime minister in that, since the country's independence, ended up in prison for corruption or some other reasons, either because they were actually corrupt or because the parties framed them as being corrupt. Regardless of that, this is not a normal, transition of power. The fact that the military infiltrates most economic institutions and has a central hold on the economy certainly doesn't help matters. The fact that you have, these courts, making these rulings on extreme religious grounds against people from, you have Christians being sentenced to death on a regular basis, and then somebody else has to intervene and overrule it to avoid a major international scandal. It's not really a democracy in the true sense of the word. And the fact that we're talking about that, any democracy without talking about the underlying institutions makes it all kind of a farce. And in this election, we are seeing there are no, there may be victims, but they're not necessarily any good parties to root for. Imran Khan may be in the right, in the sense that he is being deliberately excluded from the political process, and likely some of the charges against him are trumped up. But then again, it's very hard to say, because there's such a tradition of corruption across all these people that maybe the entire parliament should be in prison for corruption. Who knows? The other thing is, Imran Khan is a populist. He has been using social media effectively, but social media is not just about Imran Khan and his party. The shutdown of these social media sites has also deprived people of access to basic information about elections, regardless of who they are voting for. Then you have this coalition excluding Imran Khan's party, and then that in itself is not necessarily anything new. This is the challenge to any parliamentary system. But then you have major people openly admitting to election rigging and with no consequences whatsoever. So that's obviously, it's hard to, it looks bad and it looks disruptive. And when you get to some point of corruption, you just stop being good at what you do, no matter how far you've gotten with power, as the military in Pakistan has. After all, once, after decades in power, after decades of, corrupt processes, you can no longer hide that you don't necessarily care about following the law. So you become bad at it, and someone with a new approach comes, and is able to expose those flaws. And that, by the way, doesn't think that I doesn't don't take it to mean that I support what Imran Khan was doing in any way. But I think he was pretty open about what he was doing and who he was supporting. He did not pretend to be pro-Western when he was openly quoting China and Russia, but the military, while it claims to want to be closer to the United States and to Saudi Arabia and so forth, is very much benefiting from Imran Khan's policies and from the decisions made during his stay in power, and from these same investments by China. It hasn't rejected any of those things. It has just tried to downplay them to avoid losing support elsewhere. So all of that is now coming to the surface, and I think a lot of the support for Imran Khan is not only because he knows how to manipulate social media and he's a famous cricketer. I think cricket player. I think it's also because people are just sick of corruption, and this is a protest vote. They might not like what he actually stands for, but they see no other alternative, and there's certainly no classical liberal person to challenge the entire thing in a healthy way. There is no healthy alternative. So it's either supporting the way things always were, or supporting a disruptor, even if that disruptor is damaging in many ways. And we are heading into a very dangerous situation where there's a great potential for civil unrest over this matter if it's not resolved intelligently, potential for extremists to exploit this to cause security problems, and it may backfire across the region.
Right, right. A lot of things happening in this part of the world and a lot of things happening in Europe. Let's revisit Europe once again. Munich Security Conference. Tell us about the highlights and conclusions. What does it mean for people like us in this part of the world and even for that part of the world?
So there were four main issues on the European Union's geopolitical agenda. One was to figure out how to support Ukraine more and faster, and I'll get to that in a moment. Second was to end, humanitarian problems in Gaza and to implement the two-state solution. The third was to improve EU's relations with the so-called global South, and fourth, to strengthen defense and security issues inside the European Union, as well as assorted bilateral understandings. And of course, Russia was very big on the agenda in general, not just pertaining to Ukraine, and China as related to that, all of these issues. But frankly, none of that was defined very well. Germany and France are now sort of competing over the best way to support Ukraine. France is projecting, has suggested sending NATO troops on the ground. Germany and Poland rejected that and accused France of not providing enough actual weapons to Ukraine. So you have this internal split regarding Gaza and Israel. I mean, it's just that's not even realistic, because you have had the institution tasked with providing humanitarian aid that were just defunded by many of these countries for being linked to terrorism. And on the other hand, you have the Palestinians who, among themselves, cannot decide over, they cannot agree on a single state vision. The entire West Bank, Ramallah-based government just resigned. Hamas refuses to even consider a two-state solution. It refuses to acknowledge Israel as a neighboring state. So this is not a realistic proposal. I don't think it's even a realistic. It shouldn't have been on the agenda in that structured in that particular way. I think. And then talking about strengthening relations with global South, all of that is well and good. But again, I think the European Union, as well as the United States for that matter, and many of the other Western countries are going about it. US is finally starting to get that just symbolic promises are not going to suffice, but it has yet to fully invest into any concrete policy with anyone, be it Africa. With India, it's going a little bit better because they're finally technology exchanges and not just talks about it. There's a potential for weapon sales and things like that. But with everybody else, things are still, on very much limited to security cooperation and some climate change initiatives. There's no real strategy for any of these regions. And finally, regarding strengthening defense and security, Europe is waking up to the fact that they need to have defense budget. They're starting a defense initiative in the Red Sea, but it's not really effective. It doesn't do anything. It's separate from the US and UK effort. It's actually splitting the allies in some ways. So it's actually the opposite is effective, and it's sending a bad signal to the purported adversaries. To be frank, I think while the issues that were outlined were important and should be discussed, the way the discussion goes just shows how much the West is kind of missing the forest for the trees and completely, on a conceptual level, misunderstands the problems it's facing.
Right, right. But who is asking who to get into this phone hacking and spying on European Parliament Defense Committee members? Help us understand this. What do they want to achieve? Is it? Do you think it's true? It's false? There are news reports about this.
Well, let's be clear. We've had a whole series of reports alleging very, similar allegations now for years. It's all started with Snowden. There's no doubt that there's some level of cyber snooping, even among so-called allies, among Western states and others. There's always intelligence gathering. And quite frankly, when you have a circumstance where some members of those committees are implicated in dealings with controversial figures, it's natural that they are going to be surveilled by somebody somewhere as part of the process of trying to understand the interactions with those controversial figures, be they Russians, Chinese, Iranians, North Koreans, or anyone else. So there are legitimate reasons for people to be surveilled at any point in time. So that's the first factor that we have to look at. But then there's another issue, which is that the reports of the snooping are not really well supported. They come from the very same organizations that have made these accusations against their favorite targets while covering up Chinese commercial spyware and Russian commercial spyware, like the Kaspersky company. So it's hard to take these reports very seriously when there is no clear evidence of who is doing it, to whom, why, and how, and when these reports lack technical substantiation, but have all the reasons in the world to kind of try to sow disagreements among European countries at a time when polarization is at an all-time high as it is, and when Russia is looking for nothing more than to find disunity. China is very much doing the same thing, and all these powers are united by a goal to exploit any possible divisions.
Right, Irina. Now, one last topic. It's a very difficult thing that is US is facing is that on in the skies they again see a Chinese balloon, and on the ground they are seeing Chinese panda diplomacy happening, and in the sky this balloon thing happening. Help us understand what is this panda diplomacy all about? What should we make out of this Chinese balloon apparently in the US skies? What is happening actually in that part of the world?
So Pentagon has blamed the latest balloon on a hobbyist without any substantiation, even though this balloon hovered over military bases and basically pursued the same route across the entire country as the previous Chinese spy balloon that we all know about. I think they are trying to avoid a confrontation with China, even after a slew of recent incidents that involved US Coast Guard boarding Chinese ships, numerous spy balloons, and confrontations around Taiwan area, and all sorts of belligerent gestures. But there's been efforts to fight to join a conversation on fentanyl reduction, on putting pressure on China to stop the flow of drugs into the United States through Mexico and so forth. So I believe that the administration is deliberately turning a blind eye on very obvious, spy operations because they don't want a bigger political problem at the moment. Even as China, by the way, is sending, guard vessels allegedly into their navy into the Middle East, into the Gulf of Aden. On the other hand, panda diplomacy, while many people think it's a cute way to build cultural diplomatic relations between people, it's actually a highly manipulative way of controlling by China, which has exercised a monopoly on panda ownership, and it's legally essentially it's a legal policy that's been in place for many years. They used to give pandas as gifts to zoos, but since the 80s they only lent them on lease to the countries with whom they deemed to have important diplomatic and political relations. And at the height of the recent crisis on a political level, the Chinese removed those pandas. So you would think, why are they punishing the American people for the decisions made by politicians who are dealing with securities? Average Americans, even if they vote for these people, don't vote for them every day. They vote them once every 2 to 4 years, 6 years in some cases, and most of them don't really care one way or the other and are not involved in politics at all. So but this is a way to pressure, to manipulate, and to send a signal that the political actions by the US government are tied also to people relations. And both will get worse if the US basically does not act in a way that garners the Beijing's approval. And now that they see that US is kind of taking a step back from the pressure, they are talking about restoring this panda diplomatic effort. It's a carrot and stick approach, and it's very, very cynical in many ways.
Right. US is facing a lot of hard choices and different aspects, whether it's the balloon or even in the Middle East, because their stand is different. Netanyahu has spelled out his vision for Gaza governance, and USS is already facing issues with regards to Ukraine, with all those things, in so many hands. And it can't do anything about the US balloon, but it is trying to balance it out with new relationships in different parts of the world, including with, trying to get India on its sides. That's the impression, the world is getting. How would you have acted if you were the US president, Irina? How would you have handled it? Because it's a lot to handle at this point in time for the US.
Well, a lot of these crises are linked together because the coalition of actors behind them is, the same countries working together, so you can't view them as completely separate problems. That's first of all. Second, showing weakness anywhere means accepting weakness everywhere. And so both friends and enemies will act accordingly, draw lessons, and look either to exploit or to form ties with somebody else who is stronger. That's just a basic lesson. So I think the Biden administration needs to kind of review its general approach to everybody at the same time. Third, you're trying to influence somebody, particularly if somebody is strong and has their own interests. You need to bring something to the table. You can't either beg or threaten with nothing to show for it. You need to have a concrete proposal, a strategy in place, and you have to understand that it's going to take time to work out. It's not going to happen overnight. You have to be patient, and you have to work with it, and you have to build trust with smaller gestures until they build up into something substantial. And this is where they've been struggling with. I think with India, they are sort of on the right path, but I don't think they're still quite getting, this whole balancing thing and what that actually means. And actually, Prime Minister Modi made a very clear message recently. He said to the US, you should be with us because China is a bully. And I think India made its interest quite clear to anyone who's actually listening. There's been a lot of concern. Well, is India with us or against us? They joined BRICS. They have a lot of, Russian influence and so on. I think that message was very clear. Where it matters, India absolutely wants to be closer to the West. So let's pursue it on the terms that we can at the moment. There is an opportunity. So I think that's where we should be looking at. And it could be leveraged in support in other areas, such as the Middle East. There are different ways to look at any problem. So some looked at the G20 summit and looked at it and said, well, US is isolated on the question of Israel and Gaza because US is the only one, not abstaining or directly voting in support and so on and so forth. I say look at it differently. Look, you have an opportunity to gain an ally and you have an opportunity to gain support in this and this area. Okay, maybe India is not ready to vote with the US at the United Nations, but maybe there could be an alternative mediator with more credibility than, for instance, Qatar, that has failed to produce any good results. Maybe they could be brought in to assist with the humanitarian aid distributions because they're not tied to terrorist organizations, and therefore they will give the aid to the people on the ground, and maybe they could be used as peacekeepers to ensure that the terrorist organizations don't take away the aid afterwards. So there are different ways of engaging with people that's in between 0 and 100%. And I think US, if it wants to not be seen as isolated, it has opportunities. It doesn't, not everybody is an enemy, and looking at it as a zero-sum game, looking at diplomacy as a zero-sum game is a big mistake. You have to look where your potential allies are and meet them there, or meet them halfway there, and then push them to do more.
Absolutely. Thanks for making us understand all these difficult things. And as we continue forward, you will continue. The world continues to move forward. I'm sure, every second week we'll come back with Irina Tsukerman to make sense of all the things that has been happening in the last 2 weeks.
Thank you so much.
With this, it's a wrap on this very special edition of The World According to Irina Tsukerman on the KJ Masterclass Live. Thank you so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you.